So we're really excited to talk. I mean, this is interesting. Watching the last panel where this topics come up again and again today about the notice and the claims administration, the payment issue, because it's a new thing in some respects with the new regimes that we have in the UK and Europe. And that's why you got 4 Americans up here, right? I mean, we're here to talk about some of the practical experience that we have working on these projects for years and years. So really quick, my name's Cameron Azari. I've been at Epiq for over 22 years, dealing with notice and claims administration issues. And I want to introduce my other panelists. And I have misplaced my glasses, so this is going to be a challenge. Okay, so let's talk about Scott first. Scott Hardy formed Top Class Action in 2008 because he saw a need to consolidate and clarify class action news in a consumer-friendly and organized way. Scott hired journalists and other professionals to write about class actions and injustices that he saw in the marketplace. And it's enabled his entity to report on class action news as it breaks. And also, he's aggregated a lot of followers. And that's been a way that Scott has really been a benefit to our industry in terms of being able to drive people to participate in these cases. Got David White. David's over here. He has more than 20 years of experience in incentive programs, management and growing payments, in growing payments businesses and divisions. He's worked directly with about 1/3 of the Fortune 1000 companies, managed I'm sure thousands of consumer programs. And Dave started to at least came on my radar 3 or 4 years ago, as he was really one of the first people to come in and talk about digital payments in our space. He's really been an expert in that piece. And then Steve Weisbrot, my friend Steve Weisbrot down at the end. He's an internationally recognized class action notice expert. He's known for his innovative data-based notice plans. He's a regular writer and lecturer on the circuit. Steve's a colleague and also a competitor, so I don't want to say too many nice things about him up here in front of everybody. But no, Steve has worked really hard. He's not just in the U.S., he's established himself as an expert internationally as well on these topics. So really pleased to have all these guys here.
Well, and more importantly with Steve is if you are eating anywhere in Europe, you need a recommendation, ask him.
So we've tried to find a way to structure our panel that will be helpful. There's so many things to talk about in the notice and administration process. We're not going to talk about probably claims administration at all. That's a great idea for a panel, maybe next year. Maybe we're farther along on some of these where that's going to be great. But we're going to talk a lot about notice. And because we have Dave here, we're going to talk about some of the distribution pieces, the digital payment pieces. And we try to find a way to sort of provide a structure for this. And so we have a couple of hypotheticals. We may or may not get into too much detail on those, but we thought we'd have one that would be more of an opt-in, a generic, think of a generic, not a generic drug, but think of a technology company. Obviously, there's a lot of cases that involve that. In an opt-in regime, and then also maybe a generic drug in more of an opt-out scenario. So some of our questions, if we want some structure, we can talk about that. And the first thing we want to talk about is, and maybe in the context of the opt-in regime or book building, is book building. That's a piece that a lot of you have familiarity with. It's a little bit different than what we do in the UK, but it's a critical piece. And I want to turn this over to Scott to talk a little bit about his experience and how he might be able to share that in the context of both the UK and the European regimes.
Sure, so thanks, Cam.
Yep.
So Top Class Actions, we now have Top Class Actions UK. It's around 50,000 people a month on the website. We've got Top Class Actions Canada, anywhere from 100 to 150,000 viewers a month on it, depending on the stories we're covering. And we've been focused on continuing to try to sign up people. We're doing some things in Ireland. I think my friend Dave Coleman was out there somewhere. It's been interesting as the business has progressed in the U.S., where we were doing everything opt-out, but then we had some bad rulings from a plaintiff's perspective to force us to go into arbitration in a lot of cases. And now we are actively working on a number of different arbitration cases that are, of course, opt-in in the U.S. And we have a massive reach, which is extremely helpful for those types of cases. And so whether you're doing the opt-in, whether you're doing the opt-out, which of course is new here, but thankfully growing. I think that it's important to be working with a partner that has a lot of experience doing that. I know Steve's done a ton of opt-in, both in the UK and across the EU. Steve and I compare notes all the time on those types of cases. And so it's, when you have an established audience, and it's not just saying, hey, here are the people that we're going after, but when you already have a lot of people signed up, it gives you a lot more flexibility in being able to broadly target across many different advertising platforms those same types of people. And that's where you get a big advantage of working with someone who already has signed up a lot of cases across the board, because they're able to get you more opt-in candidates or potential clients at typically a lower cost per acquisition.
So what, and this to Steve too, and Scott, how, in the context of getting the claimants, what are the methods that you would recommend using to aggregate, to contact those claimants, to get them signed up, and then also to properly vet them? I know we have the Salesforce Oracle example has been brought up a couple of times where clearly not anything or not enough was done really to do this. What are the ways to do that to make sure for the clients you're working with that they're getting a real reliable set of potential claimants?
Well, from our experience, we try to get as many people as possible signed up. And, anyone who's ever worked a class action settlement on Top Class Actions, you get a big response. And we've even done some now internationally, which have garnered a large response because we get so much press coverage. And so if we cover a settlement, then it's guaranteed that whatever country that we're covering that settlement, there's going to be news about it. But making sure that you've got a great, very, very tight set of requirements if you're going for the lead plaintiffs or the named plaintiffs, that's hugely important. We don't want to hear from our clients, Scott, you couldn't actually, you sent us 10,000 potential clients here and none of them signed. And so making sure that we've got the right criteria in place and that we're targeting those people, that is hugely important. And then having that follow-up. You have to have that immediate follow-up. Because nowadays, people are used to getting an immediate text message and immediate follow-up email, so that way they know that they're actually getting engaged with. Which of course means that whenever people are signing up, they have to have the right disclaimers there. Yeah. Because we didn't want to be that ironic class action website that got sued for not having the right privacy disclaimers.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Just to add on to Scott, I think that from a fundamental perspective, engaging in book building activity and engaging in the practice of legal notification have a tremendous amount of differences. Yeah, and I think the primary, albeit not the only difference, is the content and the methods that you can use. When you're doing a book build, you are free within the bounds of the SRA regs and in the US, the Continuing Legal Education Board's rubrics to say a lot of different things, to use a lot of different imagery. It is not dry legalese like Christy was just saying in the last panel. It's not a 24-page, 10-point font doctrine on shareholder rights. That's not what you're doing. You're telling people they may be entitled to compensation. And these are all things that wouldn't be acceptable acting as a formal arm of the court when you're doing legal notification, where the primary goal is to ensure that everyone receives due process and has the ability to opt out or opt in, as the case might be, object or file a claim. So they're very different skill sets. In terms of verifying claimants, the one thing that has become abundantly clear to me, working in lots of jurisdictions, is that it's a much higher threshold in terms of making sure that A, you run your KYC checks, so you're gonna want that integrated directly into your intake process. But more than that, it's super detail oriented. It shouldn't just be claimant raises their hands and says, for instance, I drove one of these vehicles that is being accused of having diesel emissions issues. You need VIN numbers. You need financing documents. You need to be able to give the claimant's firm sufficient security that when they're putting their name on, the claimant's name on a register, that the defense counsel isn't going to come back and say, you know what, Mickey Mouse doesn't actually live at 123 Main Street, and he shouldn't be on your register. So I think a very data-based process becomes increasingly important, and using third-party data sources, whether that's from the DVLA in the case of an emissions, or buying a commercial list of known homeowners in a particular area if it's geographic based. Long story short is it's not quite as simple as it might be to get someone to opt in other jurisdictions. This is a particularly detailed jurisdiction, and you can expect scrutiny on your register list if you're not doing it the right way. So it's important to make sure that you do have the right vendor who has those sort of cross checks in place.
And I think at that stage, the communication piece, Steve, you alluded to, you have a lot more freedom to communicate. And, and in addition to telling people they may potentially be able to get money, which is important, I think it's also critical at that stage to message you want people to feel good and feel like they're doing something in getting involved in the litigation. And you want to communicate with them. Like you said, the engagement piece is incredibly important. You want to have a back and forth, whether it's a newsletter like Scott does, some communication updates about the litigation to keep those people engaged, to make sure when you or your client gets to the stage of going to the court, they can really document that these are real people that are really interested in litigation.
You're 100% right. And the other thing that Scott said that bears repeating is that top class actions gets a lot of press. What is interesting is here, even in the context of an official filing, when you file your notice plan with the CAT, it is normal and expected to have a corresponding PR campaign, which is not something that you see at all in the United States. In fact, a lot of times when you're in the notice stage, there may be an agreement that either side will not talk to the press as to not bias the potential claimant pool. But what we do know is when cases have a lot of press, and I do a lot of cases with certain technology companies that if they walk down the street, the tech press is covering it. Mm-hmm. And on those cases where you see a tremendous amount of press, you see more filers than you ever would, and you can go back and quantify what day a story ran and how many claims you have. Similarly, when Scott sends out his newsletter, I'm well aware of it because claims spike. But I guess my overarching point is whether you're in a book build posture or you're in the posture that the tribunal requires you to publicize it, using the right partner on the PR front is incredibly important. But then take it a step further, because what happens typically is someone will see a news story or hear a news story when they're riding in their car, but what happens next, right? Do they remember the exact URL that they need to go to in order to register or file a claim? Well, most times, no. So you need to have an administrator who is actively monitoring the press activity and is correspondingly increasing your budget on search and on programmatic advertising on the days where you're expecting press, because what happens is someone goes, oh, what was that case about? Where do I get there? You Google it, that's when you need to be grabbing those people. It needs to be integrated. All of these things are great, all of these different methods, but they work best when they work in concert.
And having that kind of messaging is why I started Top Class Actions. It was because there were different websites out there that were tracking class actions, consumer class actions, but they were all from a lawyer's perspective. And so I built Top Class Actions from a consumer's perspective. And one of the big questions I get from people, they say, why, Scott, why should I bother participating in these lawsuits? And so having that messaging that you're talking about really targeted to them so they understand why they're taking the time to participate, why the lawsuit was actually filed, and that message affects them. One of our big focuses within my law firm, as well as within Top Class Actions, is working and providing compassion with our victims. And whether it's a small claim or whether it's a massive claim, we try to build that connection. And that's what I would encourage with all of the lawyers here, is that you are working, especially if you're a plaintiff lawyer, that you are working to connect on a compassionate level with your individual clients, because that will bring them back, and that will make sure that you are viewed as their lawyer for everything in the future. And that's the way our viewers view us, is they say, if it's class action related, then we trust Top Class Actions, and that's why we have that 1 million, 2 million people a month now.
You saying that made me think of something, because I always, we're called because we have experience within the U.S. system, right, to talk about how we've done things. And also, I think all of us have had the benefit of saying, this is what we do in the U.S., and that's not really the best way to do it. And we want to help, convey those lessons learned here, too. And one thing that's interesting about the UK system, and I believe also the new rule in the Netherlands, is the status of the class representative. That is such a game changer, I think, for you. We heard Mr. Merrick speak earlier today, and when I had the benefit of early on working on the Merrick's case and meeting Mr. Merrick's, and this is a class representative. I'm like, class representative? I've never met a class representative in the U.S. in my life in 22 years. And it's such a benefit to have an individual with stature and name recognition in the market where your potential claimants are going to be. And that tool should never be underestimated and should be used at every stage in terms of hiring the PR firm and doing the notice and every piece. It's such a piece of credibility that it lends to your system. I wish, if I could snap my fingers, I would change the U.S. system to be the same.
I agree, Cam. I think it is a game changer, and I think it also gives the claimants firms the ability to control the narrative around the case from day one.
Yeah.
You have someone with stature, you get them in front of the right reporters and the right character, the narrative they're putting out and the credentials that they have gives a, what's the word I'm looking for? A real...
gravitas.
What?
Gravitas.
Was not the word, but I'll steal it. Gravitas. And it really helps solidify the claim in a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, for sure.
And the other thing that I think is unique going to the class representative is, at least under the tribunal rules, there's a requirement to publicize the filing of the case. We don't have that in the United States, Canada, Australia, any of the jurisdictions that we work in. And I think it's a really unique and welcome feature, because you can start creating a buzz about the case and letting the public know from day one and follow it and make an informed decision whether this is something that they want to get into. A lot of times in the United States, the first time an eligible claimant hears about the case is when he has to make a decision whether or not to join. There's no kind of knowledge. He doesn't really know what it's about. And he's searching through that 12-page document that's usually written such that only lawyers can understand it. And here you have the ability to create sort of a groundswell around the case, and it's something that shouldn't be overlooked. And I will tell you, I do think people are overlooking it, and I don't mean to disparage any of the funders in the room, but it makes sense from a funding perspective to tranche when you're spending your money. And everyone says, that first initial notice under the CAT rules, we'll just do enough to get by. Let's save it for when people are filing claims. And I understand the logic, but at the same time, I think that claim filing rate at the end of the case is going to be much higher if you spent money 2 years earlier and started getting people used to it, learning the nomenclature, learning the players, learning what this is about, and following it in the press.
And I apologize for interrupting, but that is so important, because we follow every class action from the moment it's filed to the moment checks or payments have been digitally received. And our viewers, one of the most popular comment on Top Class Actions,
Add me.
2 words, yes, add me. And so as soon as we report on a class action, we have a huge upswelling of interest in this case. And so now we actually reach out to those people and we say, hey, this has just been filed, you can't actually submit a claim yet, but we'll notify you once it's out there.
You respond to each of those people?
Yeah, we're now tracking that.
That's great. I didn't know that. That's awesome.
So this is a good segue. Let's talk a little bit about, Steve, you and I have both done the CPO notice, which, as you just alluded to, tends to be pretty light. Either let's talk about what you would do if it was your choice to do a more robust notice at that stage, or what are the things you think about when you're designing a notice plan at the time you want people to really respond when we get to the claim stage? What are the pieces? And feel free to use the hypotheticals.
Well, I'll use the hypotheticals, but first I'm going to speak practically.
Yeah.
One of the, I think, handicaps of having to put in the notice and administration plan to the CAT on day one is that we have no idea what the media landscape is ultimately going to look like if this settles in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. So saying that we're going to use, I guess we use a timely example, Twitter, looks very different today than it did 3 weeks ago, right? And there can be lots of other similar changes. Some platforms no longer exist, and essentially we're putting together a plan, telling the court how to best do it at this frozen moment in time. So my one practical piece of advice before I really answer your question, Cam, is to provide some flexibility in your notice and administration plan. And I find that the attorneys that we work with are very reticent to not say we're doing X, Y, and Z, no matter what, this is the best way to do that. And I'll show why that doesn't make sense in a second while answering your question. Do we have those slides? Are we using them? Okay. So prior to coming together for this group talked about those two different groups, right? A group of people who might be on a generic diabetes medicine and someone who uses a social media platform. And one of the things that notice providers and really brand advertisers and advertising agencies have access to are syndicated data that can tell you a tremendous amount, sorry, a bug of sorts, can tell you a tremendous amount about the type of person you're hoping to reach. And this information is very granular in terms of their demographics, their household income, et cetera. But more important from my perspective is it also lets you know the ways in which they consume media. So going back to our two examples, and what do you think about it? It's like, where are you going to place this notice is the first question. Now, if you look at the data that we pulled on the diabetes customer, as expected, it skews older, and they tend to use the internet much less frequently than someone who is on a social media platform. They also tend to read about, I think it was 3 times as many issues of magazines than someone from a younger generation. I've always been, I think, synonymous in the United States with arguing for more digital notice, more social media notice. But that's not always the best case. I would not take out a massive Facebook campaign to reach diabetes customers. You know, backs of the right magazines and the right newspapers is where you want to go with them. Again, integrated plan, a sprinkling of this, a sprinkling of that is only going to help. But if you then, one of the concepts that we use in the United States a lot is called reach percentage. And it's where you can quantify on a somewhat objective means what percentage of your target audience saw the messaging for the class action notice or for any notice. And a lot of times, the cheapest way to do it is to use digital media because it's a younger class, everyone's on social media, you can get really good rates, et cetera. But if you're trying to reach this diabetes customer, and I didn't run the math on this, but I'm almost certain that it would be cheaper to use a few select magazines that are read within the older community, and I mean that in the nicest way possible. So you really have to have an understanding of who you're trying to reach, where they get their news. The more information that you know about them, the better. And while I said we rely on these objective syndicated data services that we all pay a lot of money for access to, ultimately, the number one person who can tell you who you're trying to reach is that plaintiff's counsel. And to just rely on the objective data that comes from survey data, et cetera, without having a meaningful and real conversation about who the attorneys have been speaking to. What have they learned? What are the trends? Do they all congregate around something that isn't obvious? So I would urge you, when you are setting up your media plans, to talk very detailed with your notice provider, because there's only so much that data can tell us. You're the ones on the phone with these people, and we have to defer to that.
Yeah, I agree with everything Steve said, and part of echoing what he just said, doing notice plans like this, I just tell people you have to think. You have to think about the specific situation you're in. There aren't any cookie cutter notice plans. The situation changes every time. It may be, and even if the target audience is similar, on two cases, the settlement might be, if there is a settlement, might lead you one way or another. If it's a £1 million settlement and it's a £100 million settlement, that's going to probably be very different notice plans.
Yeah.
And so it's really a thoughtful thing, and talking to the plaintiff's counsel here, talking to the class representative, dealing with a PR firm, which again is a big plus here too, everything going hand in hand. We could talk about this forever, right? But I want to make sure that we get to my friend Dave. We'll talk a little bit about digital payments. This is, it always sounds weird, I think, to people in the UK and Europe, but we've sent a lot of checks in the US. I mean, we're really check heavy still. And finally, within the last couple of years, we've made this transition over to paying people digitally. And it's been a game changer in a lot of ways. And Dave, I just want to get your general comments about the process and how you see it going.
No, I appreciate that. And it's fitting that I'm going last, because we're really the last part of the engagement process. As you go through this entire I'll call it engagement, where all of us, even though our functions are very different, it's an engagement tool to get to class action settlements and members. The world has gotten smaller, obviously, in the last so many years, as evidenced by the attendees in this room. Our perspective on payments is much broader than just class actions, but consumer payments as a whole. As you said, if you asked this question 5 years ago, checks was the predominant payment vehicle. And I think I heard the question asked earlier a few times, in fact, when you have multiple jurisdictions, multiple regions, how do you distribute damages? And I don't know that anybody had a great answer. Well, we have an answer, and it is an evolving answer, but it started based on what we began in this space in the US several years ago, whereas instead of just eliminating the stamp, I think I heard that referenced earlier, or eliminating the cost of the check, I would say eliminate all of that cost. Take the cost out of the equation, make it more instant, more digital. Our company, our process involves, and our products involved digital MasterCards, digital Visas, virtual merchant e-gifts, those types of things. But what we've seen evolve in the settlement space in the States, now evolving over into Europe, evolving over into Asia-Pac, is now much broader, and not just a single payment type for consumer class action settlements, but choices. Choices that may not even be provided by a single company. We would argue that if you look at consumers as a whole, they're focused on three things. They want convenience, they want choice, and they want security when it comes to their payments. And this is across every industry that we service. From a convenience standpoint, digital is easier. Nobody is going to the bank anymore. People aren't cashing checks as they have traditionally. In fact, Steve, you and I had talked about this earlier in the week, the unbanked population in various parts of the world is staggeringly high. And not just because of certain demographic reasons or certain disadvantaged reasons from a population standpoint, but younger folks aren't getting bank accounts like they used to. You might be surprised to hear that 25% of the US is considered unbanked or underbanked. So if you give them a paper check, they don't necessarily have an easy way to cash that without spending money. If you look at Europe, especially Eastern Europe, the percentages can be even higher. Fun fact, as I learned this researching for this, what country in the world has the highest banked rate? Any guesses? This one, the Netherlands. So interestingly enough, but that also goes with, they have almost a 0% cash transaction rate. People don't use cash here. So if you think about the way people associate with money and how they spend it, they want digital. So offering them a digital prepaid card really offers them more convenience. Two other things I mentioned: choice, offering a variety of payments is key in this space. And then third, security. This is, and we may segue into a broader conversation here, security with regard to payments and everything else that we do here is, I think, the number one rising concern, at least among financial institutions from our perspective. The bad actors are everywhere, and when it involves money and large sums of money, as we often deal with, the fraud and the security factors across the board are increased, which really bodes well for eliminating a BACS transaction or asking someone for their banking information or giving them a check that has to go into a bank account that they may or may not have easy access to. If you give them a payment tool or options to payment tools that are safe, such as a Visa or a MasterCard, whether it be physical or digital, those are very easy to manage fraud because it's oftentimes limited to that one account, that one transaction. If there is suspect activity, we cancel it and reissue another one. It's easy. It's not exposing customer sensitive banking data or their own personal data. So.
Can I give Dave a plug real quick? We had a case recently, and we work with Dave a good deal, and as well as some of his competitors. And we had a case involving a US-based car rental company that was overcharging foreigners on insurance that they told them, or allegedly told them, that they had to purchase if they were going to rent a car. So when we received the class list and we did our data aggregation, I think it was 111 different countries that were represented. And we've done distributions in a lot of different countries, but that was just an astounding amount of countries and thought as to how we do it. And we use Dave's digital MasterCard product because it's accepted virtually everywhere. And I know he spoke about security, but the one thing he didn't mention is that his company obviously does OFAC checks to make sure that we're not giving this to a country on the no-no list, right? And everyone seems to know what a MasterCard is. And it's been a very successful program distributing in so many different countries that we never could have done if we were sending checks. Would they be able to negotiate our checks in the Philippines? I don't know, right? Dave's the payment expert, but what they can do is use a MasterCard everywhere, and that's been an extremely helpful product. And the other thing I just want to piggyback on is he talks about underbanked, and I don't profess to be a payment expert in any country other than the U.S., but I do know that the real consequence of being underbanked and getting a check isn't just the convenience factor. It's that the only place you can cash it is a check cashing store, and they take a chunk of the money. And let's be frank, a lot of class actions, you're getting a check for under $25. And if you're giving away 25% of your $25 to someone for the convenience of being able to cash your check, it's really a hit to the claimant. So having these options is really important. And if anyone's curious, I don't have them committed to memory, but I think we did 6.6 million digital payments so far this year. I think that's the number. And we've categorized it by what type of digital payment the claimant has chosen, whether that be PayPal, Zelle, Venmo. If they combine, they'd be Zenmo. And we can take a look at that. And there's really an interesting correlation between the type of case we're doing and the selection of the payment, which is why, to your point, giving people options is so important.
Well, I think it's cool as we're seeing more and more global class actions filed. We got our friends from Milberg here who are exerting pressure globally. We've got Pogus Goodhead filing cases for defendants all over the world. And having a payment solution that can take care of your plaintiffs and your clients globally is huge, because I think in 5 years, we're going to see a global pressure come on some of these defendants. That we're going to be filing the case in the US as it's being filed in the UK, as it's being filed in the Netherlands, in Canada, and we'll be looking for a global settlement. And I think that having this kind of solution is incredibly important.
Yep. And just to add to that, Steve, what you were saying is when you issue a digital visa in various countries, Visa is not the same in all of those countries. There are different currencies. So a visa that we issue here is going to be different. It's going to be in euro versus a visa that we issue in the UK is going to obviously be in British pounds versus US dollars, even though they can cross borders when you're issuing the dollars based on global and local regulatory licenses, from e-money licenses, and it depends on the country that you're in as to how they refer to it. Money transmitter licenses in the US, e-money licenses here in Europe, they require in-country currency, and that also ties back into the OFAC limitations. So as you cross borders, you have to be aware of all these things.
One thing I thought of a minute ago is that with checks, I know this group, again, in Europe, it's not as accustomed to checks as we are, but checks is it's viewed as like the end, we're done. Send a check, we're done. With digital payments, I've really learned it's a continuation of the engagement process with the claimants. I mean, Dave, you can speak to this in detail, but we're reaching out to them before the payments are made to let them know it's coming. Because it's a huge issue to get people to redeem payments. I mean, we send checks and we're lucky if we get 70% of the people cash them. And that problem could exist in the digital payment world too in terms of redemption, but there's an easy mechanism to be reaching out to people, continuing the conversation. Maybe there's a redistribution process that occurs. We've established a communication channel with the claimants. It's easy to get them to do it.
Yeah, I mean, we look at, and this industry is a bit unique in the sense that they're not necessarily your customers, but most of the consumer payments that we issue globally are to customers, and our clients want to engage further with their customers. So this is no different in that regard. So you issue a payment such as a check, it gets cashed, maybe not. Maybe it gets thrown out, or maybe it sits on the coffee table because nobody goes to the bank anymore. But the reality is that doesn't continue the experience, the engagement. With the digital reward, now that's in your mobile wallet. Now that's it's in your email. It's someplace that every time you spend it, you're re-engaging with that process. Plus it's more. More easily identified, so it's more likely to get consumed. And that goes back to what do consumers want today? They want choice and they want instant gratification. Scott, you had mentioned that. So providing this in a much more timely manner, in a way that is recognizable to them, because there's a lot of noise out there. You get a lot of junk mail, you get a lot of other types of engagement. Okay, this is my settlement from this, because I've noticed this consistent branding throughout the process, and that payment is the final chapter there that can extend the relationship.
Yeah. Gentlemen, anything else you want to cover? We're up on time. I'm cognizant of often, nobody's asked a question yet, but I think we all like to talk about what we do, and to the extent you don't feel comfortable asking a question here, we're going to go to lunch here in a second. We really would like it if you came up and asked us some questions. We have the whole group here has a lot of experience with the notice and the claim. We even talk about claims, the claims administration and the distribution piece. And we love sharing that because we're all interested in the emerging markets we have for collective litigation here. And like I said earlier, we see things that we don't do very well in the U.S. and we'd love to help you as you design a program that's better for your constituents here.
Yeah, I just want to add to that one thing is that CAM's so on point. Like there are so many things that can be done better that have kind of just become rote in the U.S. But earlier, I think there was a question about distributions and how you do that in a cartel case where there are multiple defendants. And that is one of the things in the U.S. that we have a tremendous amount of experience with. And we're trying to share those good points from the U.S. So just for everyone's edification, the way that typically happens in the United States is when one of the defendants settles, typically the icebreaker defendant, they call it, we'll do a distribution of just that defendant's share of the pot. Sometimes 2 or 3 will settle, and then we'll wait until there's a critical mass, and we'll do a secondary distribution, and sometimes a tertiary distribution. But it's not sit on the money, wait forever. There is established guidelines and platforms for how this is done in the U.S. that have worked successfully for decades, and I do think that's like one of the pieces that we bring to the table that we can help with by repeating what we do in the U.S. And we can also warn you of things that just aren't so great, and we know they're not so great, but they're canonized. That's what they are now, and there's very little we can do about it here. But the people in this room collectively have the ability to write the rules and to do it better and take what we know that's good and apply it, and take what we know that isn't as good and change it. And I know I speak for everyone up here, and Cam and I have discussed this a lot offline. We are very friendly competitors. We really have an opportunity to write the rules here and to figure out how to do this the right way. And we have the benefit of a lot of baseline knowledge, and we also have the benefit of having a lot of really smart people looking at this through a fresh set of eyes. And I know we're all really excited to be a part of that.
Yeah. Hopefully, if we're lucky to be asked back next year, we have some of these cases have got to that point where we can talk about some of the practical experiences.
Drew, get busy.
Well, thanks, everybody. We really appreciate it. Again, an honest offer to ask us questions later, but thank you very much.